You're going to be hearing a lot from me. I'm giving a lot of talks. So this is sort of a funny topic. I was asked to talk about how ITMIG has changed the management of thymoma, sort of being asked to give an advertisement for ITMIG. So full disclosure is I'm maybe moderately involved with ITMIG. I did run one of the meetings. I am an admirer of the group. I think they've sort of been able to turn what was basically an orphan disease into a disease that's at least on the way to having some stuff change and be understood, and there's some scientific approach for it. And I think Frank Detterbeck, who founded the group, has been amazing in the way he's pushed it. So maybe I'm slightly biased, but I think ITMIG is on its way to making a pretty significant impact. So, what's the background is that there's been no change basically in the survival of thymic malignancies for 3 decades. Not a lot of progress, at least on the survival front. And maybe the reason for that is that the literature is pretty abysmal. So the 79% of the literature before ITMIG started on thymic malignancies were case reports. And you can see the cohort studies were generally small, and 5% of studies are cohort studies greater than 100 patients. So it's a very rare disease with correspondingly bad science in the papers. So the idea or the mission for ITMIG was to promote the advancement of clinical and basic science pertaining to thymic malignancies and other mediastinal tumors, and to provide structural organization and scientific rigor to research in these diseases. And then under the mission are the primary goals, which are to provide infrastructure, to promote science-based approach to the research, and then to disseminate the research. And I guess you could argue it was a little bit on the model of the IMIG, which we heard about a little bit from Paul, but maybe has been even more successful. I'm not sure. So has it worked? Have they met the goals, and has anything actually changed in management, which is obviously a harder issue? ITMIG was only invented in, I think, 2011. So it's a fairly short interval to expect to see major management changes. So it's a surgery-dominant group, or I guess predominant would be the word. What's the word for not greater than half, but a plurality. The surgeons make up a plurality of the group. But as you can see, it is quite multidisciplinary, and it is quite international with people from North America, Europe, and Asia. And so the membership is spread all around. The meetings are every year, and on alternate years, they're either outside of the U.S. or in the U.S. And I think the last meeting, there were 250 to 300 attendees. So the main subcommittees that are actually doing the work of trying to bring some science to thymic malignancies are a database subcommittee, a research subcommittee, retrospective and prospective, a tissue bank, and I'll talk about the tissue bank a little bit, and then a clinical trials committee and a standards and quality committee. So the first goal was basically to develop global standards. And so committees were made in each of the major areas, and to try to come up with, well, what's the baseline? What should we be doing? What's being done now? Let's see where we're at. And there were several publications along those lines. I want to skip that one for a sec. So for example, thymic carcinoma management patterns. What are the management patterns? What are people doing? And it was found that people were doing all sorts of things, and there really weren't any standards. So they tried to establish some standards. Part of that establishing of standards was doing first a retrospective database. So it started in 2011, and every group who signed on to the database was asked to enter data from as far back as they could go, essentially. So the retrospective database is twice the size of the SEER database, to give you a sense of how big it is. So if you want to study thymic malignancies, this is the place to go in terms of retrospective studies. And now there's a prospective database that's being accumulated, which will obviously be equally important, giving a higher quality of data, but the numbers are much lower. So the first, I would say, major change that was made was a change in staging. So based on 10,000 patients instead of prior staging, Mastioka and Mastioka-Koga are based on studies of between 50 and 250 patients. So now you've got staging based on 10,000 patients. T1 includes now anything up to and including the mediastinal pleura. So that used to be, depending on which of the Masioka stages you're looking at, and there were sort of several that used to be bandied about, there was always this issue, is it invading the capsule? Is it all the way through the capsule? Which staging system includes capsular invasion or through the capsule, et cetera? So all that is gone now. And basically, it turns out that it doesn't matter. Anything up to and including the mediastinal pleura is T1. It has to include the pericardium to be T2. And if you look down at the bottom here, I point out that even T1 and T2, even invading the pericardium, is still stage 1 if it's N0. So that's a very important change. The lymph nodes are now in the staging system. So N1 is the anterior region here in front, which is sort of the area you would naturally be without trying to get outside of your usual thymectomy. And then a posterior region is, including the paratracheal nodes, et cetera, is now an N2 region. And also, there's now a distinction between just local pleural metastases, which is M1A, versus distant metastases. So these changes, first of all, establish criteria that can be followed over time in order to actually distinguish between different stages in outcomes and treatments, but also eliminate a lot of the previous sort of uncertainties about things. And the stages separate very nicely as you would expect them to. Better than the previous staging systems did. Now, the pathologists got together and thought maybe WHO is not necessary with this new staging system, but that turned out not to be the case. The histologic classification, or the WHO type, is still important, but what they did, you may know that pathologists used to have a very hard time. There was very poor inter-observer correlation on the WHO classification, which has significance for prognosis in addition to staging. So they eliminated some of these things without talking about what the pathologists do, which I don't understand very well, but they eliminated some of the things that made it difficult for pathologists to disagree. So now, based on the new staging, many more patients are in stage 1, so you would think that that would lead to less indication for adjuvant radiotherapy. And most of us, I think, who do these operations always wondered, is the radiotherapy doing any good? Because so many of the recurrences are in the pleural space, which is not even a site that the radiation therapy hits. And I think this staging system makes more sense to surgeons who understand the disease. Again, 4A pleural disease is now formally acknowledged, and lymph node dissection is now at least relevant. Although I would say that there have been subsequent papers that have shown that unless it's a B2 or greater tumor, that there's essentially no lymph node metastases. And also, if it's not at least a stage 2, so if it's a stage 1, there are no lymph node metastases. So it's only in the more advanced tumors that you should start thinking about addressing lymph nodes in a more serious way. ITMIG also now has a virtual online tumor bank, so if you're participating in that, you send in what your tissue is, and then that becomes available to other ITMIG members, and you have access, of course, to a wider area of tissue, which facilitates a lot of translational research. I think I must have missed something. The TCGA is a huge genomic study in cancers, which you may know about, which occurred in the United States. And initially, thymic malignancies were not being included. They weren't one of the tumors that were being included, but the ITMIG went to the TCGA and convinced them to include thymic tumors. So now there is genomic data coming out about thymic tumors, which will, of course, inform research about thymic tumors. For example, it's now been shown that there's a prognostic factor of 7 genes that's predictive with thymoma, and also that non-coding RNAs, microRNAs, also have prognostic significance, just like we've been learning in lung cancer in the last couple of years. In fact, with thymoma, we're almost as far as advanced as in lung cancer, I think, in that field. Here are some papers from the Retrospective Dbase that I think have impacted management to a certain extent already. There used to be sort of a suggestion that maybe neuroendocrine tumors of the thymus were really bad and almost like thymic carcinomas. And in fact, that turns out to be true in a big study from the Retrospective Dbase with relatively large numbers of patients, if you look at the numbers there along the bottom of that chart. This is a paper I participated in from Brian Burt, where we tried to make one of the early explorations of whether VATS thymectomy for thymic malignancies is actually acceptable. And we found several interesting things, some of which you might have suspected, but really proved it, which is, first of all, that people are doing more incomplete thymectomies when they do it VATS rather than when we used to do not used to do, I do a lot of median sternotomies for thymectomies, but compared to median sternotomy for thymectomy. Now, the follow-up's not very long yet, but like now subsequent papers, we've not been able to show that that has an impact on R0 resection rate in this study, because this study did not have long-term survival or long-term recurrence rates. Even in other studies now, we only have probably about 4 to 5 years of study of recurrence, which, as everyone in this room knows, is not long enough for thymic malignancies to really know whether we're doing the right thing or not by doing minimally invasive thymectomies for tumors. Here's a paper, a very important paper, I think, on radiotherapy, where using the new staging system from the ITMIG, the TNM staging system, radiotherapy is associated with longer survival for stage 2 or greater tumors, but it is not for stage 1 tumors. So this is stage 2 up here, with not as strong of a p-value, but a significant separation of the curves. And stage 3, there's a significant improvement. Whereas before this, there were really small numbers and people making a guess based on pretty much incomplete data. I thought this was a very interesting paper from the Retrospective Dbase looking at PET scan. I've always used PET, actually. I found it to be very useful separating lymphomas from thymomas in the clinic, where you got to decide if you want to do a biopsy or not, and sort of which you want to do direct surgery, et cetera. And it's always been my impression that if you've got something that's substantially bright over, say, an SUV max of 7, that it is not a thymoma. And it turns out that you can even stratify in this paper much better than that. So looking from WHO-type thymomas from A and AB up to thymic carcinomas, there's just a straight line in increasing SUV activity, which is very interesting. And so you can have a very good idea what the histologic subtype is just based on PET activity coming into the operation, and that might help guide your lymph node aggressiveness, et cetera. This didn't address that issue of lymphoma at all, but it's just something that I found useful in clinical practice. Prospective studies. So ITMIG began to consider a prospective study using heated poviodine in pleural spread, and I think it's actually mostly in Great Britain, where that's being used in mesothelioma in a couple of centers. Maybe it's just one center that publishes a lot of that. And so the idea was, well, maybe that's a good idea for thymoma with pleural spread. And it was agreed at some initial meetings that a laboratory basis for doing that was needed. So Brian Burt again went back and showed that if you use 10% poviodine for 30 minutes, that there's 95% cell death in vitro, which is a pretty simple fix for a fairly difficult problem. And so now a prospective clinical study is, I think, about to get started doing that in a phase 2 fashion. So ITMIG, I don't think we've solved everything in thymic disease at this point or made clear everyday changes in the practice, but I think the scientific basis has been set up to really make progress in this disease. It engages the vast majority of people who are active in the disease. The infrastructure has been built both for tissue and for prospective and retrospective research, and there's a real emphasis on high-quality scientific studies, and I think it's a model, as IMIG was, for other rare diseases. I appreciate your attention.